How to memorize a poem. My first assignment was to begin collecting architecture before I could embark on any serious degree of memory training. I first needed a stockpile of memory palaces at my disposal. I went for walks around the neighborhood. I visited friends' houses, the local playground, Oriole Park, and Camden Yards in Baltimore, the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art, and I traveled back in time to my high school, to my elementary school, to my house on Reno Road, where my family lived until I was 4 years old. I focused on wallpaper and the arrangement of furniture. I tried to feel the flooring under my feet. I reminded myself of emotionally resonant incidents that occurred in each room. And then I carved each building up into Lucy. That would serve as as cubby holes for memories. The goal, as Ed explained, it was to know these buildings thoroughly, to have such a rich and textured set of associations with every corner of every room, that when it came to learn something new, body of information, I could speed through my palaces, scattering just as quickly as I could sketch them in my imagination. The better I knew the buildings, and the more each felt like home, the stickier my images would be, and the easier it would be to reconstruct them. Ed, finding I'd need about a dozen memory palaces just to begin my training. He has several hundred metropolis of mental storehouse. At this point, out of full disclosure, I ought to say a word or two about my living arrangements. At the time that I began my memory training, with memory training, I was a recent college grad, trying to make it as a journalist, sponging off my parents' home in Washington, D.C., where I'd grown up. I was sleeping in my childhood bedroom with a pair of Baltimore Eagles pennants above the window, and a book of Shel Silverstein's poems on the shelf, and working in a makeshift office in the basement at a desk I'd set up between my father's Nordic track and a stack of boxes filled with old family photos. My office was awash in post-it notes, a long list of items I needed to catch up on to be returned, articles, ideas to be investigated, personal and professional chores to be completed, fortified and confined from my successes in Central Park. I tore down a handful of the most urgent items, converted them into images, and diligently filled them away in a memory palace I had constructed out of my grandmother's suburban ranch home. Get car inspected became an image of Inspector Gadget circling the old Buick in her driveway. Fine book on African kings was an occasion to imagine Shaka Zulu hurling a spear at her front door. Book Funk's ticket led me to transfer her living room into a landscape of deserts and canyons, and to picture the Sphinx rising from the ashes of her antique grandeza. This was all well and good, and even kind of fun, but it was also exhausting. I noticed upon memorizing 10 or so of my post-it notes that I felt physically tired, like my mind's eyes was getting bloodshot. This was harder work than it seemed, and much less efficient than I'd imagined. And there were still a few items on the wall I had no clue what to do with. How was I supposed to turn telephone number into image? What was I supposed to do with email addresses? I fell back into my office chair with a handful of post-it clinging to my palm, and looked up at my wall, whose off-white paint now showed through in a few additional patches, and wondering what really was the point of all this. In truth, those notes had been working just fine. Stuck on my wall. Surely the art of memory had more valuable applications. I stood up and pulled a copy of the Norton Anthology of Modern Poetry off my bookshelf. It was a 1,800-page brick of a book that I had purchased once upon a time at a used bookstore and had opened not more than twice since. If the ancient art of memory was good for anything, I figured surely it was learning poetry by heart. Simonides, I knew, was not a hero of the ancient world for having discovered a clever way to remember his to-do list. His discovery was meant to serve a humanizing agenda, and what could be more humanizing than committing poetry to memory? Ed, I have already discovered what always memorizing something. He had long ago learned the bulk of Paradise Lost by heart. At the rate of 200 lines per hour, he told me, and had been slowly slogging his way through Shakespeare. My philosophy of life is that a heroic person should be able to withstand about 10 years of solitary confinement without getting terribly annoyed. He said, give that an hour of memorization yields about 10 solid minutes of spoken poetry. And those 10 minutes have enough content to keep you busy for a full day. I figured you can squeeze at least a day's fun out of each hour of memorization. If you should ever happen to find yourself in solitary confinement, this worldview owes a lot to the collection of ancient medieval texts on memory that it had relentlessly tried to foist upon me. For those early writers, a trained memory wasn't just about gaining easy access to information. It was about strengthening one's personal ethics and becoming a more complete person. A trained memory was the key to cultivating judgment, citizenship, and piety. What one memorized helped shape one's character. Just as the secret to becoming a chess grandmaster was to learn old games, the secret to becoming a grandmaster of life was to learn old texts. In a tight spot, where could one look for guidance about how to act? If not the depth of memory, mere reading it, not necessary learning. A fact that I'm personally confronted with every time I try to remember the contents of a book I've just put down. To really learn a text, one had to memorize it. As the early 18th century Dutch poet Jan Luyken put it, one book printed in the heart's own wax is worth 1,000 in the stacks. The ancient medieval way of reading was totally different from how we read today. One didn't just memorize text. One ruminated on them, chewed them up, and regurgitated them like cud, and in the process became intimate with them in a way that made them one's own. As Petrarch said in a letter to his friend, I ate in the morning, I would digest in the evening. I swallowed as a boy what I ruminated upon as an older man. I have thoroughly absorbed these writings, implanting them not only in my memory, but my marrow. Augustine was said to be so steeped in the sounds that they, as much as Latin itself, comprised the principal language in which he wrote. This was an attractive fantasy. I imagined that if I could only learn to memorize like Simonides, I would be able to commit reams of poetry to heart. I could make a clean sweep through the best verse and really absorb it. I imagined becoming one of those admirable, if sometimes insufferable individuals who always seem to have an opposite quotient to drop into conversation. I imagined becoming a walking repository of verse. I decided to make memorizing a part of my daily routine, like flossing, except I was actually going to do it each morning after waking up and having my coffee. But before reading the newspaper or showering, or even putting on proper clothes, I sat down behind my desk and tried to spend 10 to 15 minutes working through a poem. The problem was that I wasn't any good at it. When I sat down and tried to film a memory palace with Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, a 28-line poem composed almost entirely of nonsense words, I couldn't figure out how to transform brilliant and filthy toes into images, and ended up just memorizing the poem by rote, which was exactly what I wasn't supposed to be doing. Next, I tried T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Peace. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. How could I forget that? Or rather, how was I supposed to remember it? Was I meant to put an image of a woman coming and going, speaking of Michelangelo, in my uncle's bedroom? And what was that supposed to look like? Or was I supposed to form an image of a woman? I was confused. And this was taking forever. The memory techniques, which had seemed promising while I huddled gnome-fingered with Ed on a boulder in Central Park, weren't working nearly so well. Now that I was alone in my parents' basement, I felt like I had tried on a slick pair of sneakers at the store, and now that I'd worn them home, I had a blister. Clearly, I was missing something. I turned to my newly acquired copy of the Rhetorica ad Hernium and opened the section that discusses the memorization of words. I was hoping it might offer some hints as to why I was failing so badly, but all the 2,000-year-old book could provide was consolation. Memorizing poetry and prose is extraordinarily difficult. The author willingly concocted sense, but that's exactly the point. He explains that learning text is worth doing, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. I believe that they who wish to do easy things without trouble and toil must previously have been trained in more difficult things, he writes. Having begun to futz around with memory techniques, I didn't yet have any sense of the true scope of the enterprise I was embarking upon. I still thought of my project as a harmlessly casual experiment. All I wanted to know was whether I really could improve my memory, and if so, by how much. I certainly hadn't taken Tony Busan's challenge to try to compete in the U.S. Memory Championship seriously. After all, there were more than 36 American mental athletes who train each year for the event, which takes place every March in New York City. There was no reason to think a journalist who occasionally forgets his own social security number could compete against America's top memory geeks. But as I would soon learn, Americans on the international memory circuit aren't like Jamaicans on the international bobsledding circuit. Easily the most laid back folks at any competition, and possibly even the most stylish, but not on the international stage. We are behind the curve in terms of both technique and training. Even though the best American memories can memorize hundreds of random digits in an hour, U.S. records still pale in comparison to those of Europeans. Generally, nobody in North America takes memory sport seriously enough to stop drinking 3 months before the World Championship, like the 8-time world memory champ Dominic O'Brien used to do. And from the looks of it, few competitors engage in rigorous physical training regimen that Busan recommends. One of his first unsolicited pieces of advice to me was to get in shape. Nobody downs daily glasses of cold liver oil to take omega-3 supplements. Only one American, the 4-time national champion Scott Hagwood, has ever been introduced into KL7. Even though America has run its national memory championship for as long as any country in the world, the best American memorizer has only finished in top 5 of world championships once in 1999. Perhaps it says something about our national character that America has produced none of the world's best competitive memorizers, that we're not as detail obsessed as the Germans, as punctilious as the Brits, or as driven as the Malaysians. Or maybe, as one European soberly suggested to me, Americans have impoverished memories because we are preoccupied with the future, while folks on the other side of the Atlantic are more concerned with the past. Whatever the reason, it becomes clear that if I wanted to learn more about the art of memory, if I wanted to study with the best in the world, I was going to have to go to Europe. Having spent several weeks struggling with mixed success to furnish my memory palace with poetry, I thought it time to enlist some help in order to take my efforts to the next level. The granddaddy of events on the Yearing International Memory Circuit, the World Memory Championship, was going to be held in Oxford, England. At the end of the summer, I decided I needed to go and convince Discovery Magazine to send me to write an article about the competition. I called up Ed to ask if I could crash at his place. Oxford was his home turf, where he'd grown up, gone to college, and now lived at home with his parents on the country estate located on the town's outskirts in a 17th century stone house called the Mill Farm. When I arrived at the Mill Farm, or simply the Mill Farm, as Ed sometimes referred to it, on a sunny summer afternoon a few days before the World Memory Championship, Ed greeted me and carried my bags up to his bedroom, the same one he had grown up in, with clothes scattered about the floor and 9 decades of cricket elements on his bookshelf. Then he took me into the house, its oldest wing, a 400-year-old converted stone barn linked to the kitchen. There was a piano in the corner and colorful fabric drapes on the ceiling, the remnants of a party held years ago that was never taken down. At one end of the room was a long wooden table with 8 decks of playing cards arranged at the head. "This is where I practice," Ed said, and pointed to the balcony that jutted into the upper part of the barn. "Imagine images of binary digits coming pouring down those stairs over there, right across the room. This is exactly where you would expect a memory champ to exercise, isn't it?" Before dinner, an old childhood friend of Ed's named Timmy stopped by to say hello. Ed and I came downstairs, and to find him at the table chatting with Ed's mother and father. Teen and Rod, well, his youngest sister, Phoebe, chopped vegetables from the garden at the kitchen island. Timmy now ran an online application development company. He had driven over in a BMW, wore a crisp polo shirt, and had a warm tan. Teen introduced me and explained, with a weird laugh, that Ed was my memory coach. Timmy seemed not to believe that Ed was still toying with his memory stuff. Hadn't it been quite some time since he had taken that crazy chip to Kuala Lumpur?